Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight. Thank you for joining me. My name is Glenn Rawson. Tonight is Sunday night, September 10th, 2023, and I hope that something is said tonight that will be a benefit to you. Just a quick announcement. The VIP books for this year are going out now. You should have received it or will receive it in the next few days. That book is titled When Faith Endures, and it's a collection of short stories from this last year. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can get it at glenrossenstories.com. And again, as always, to the VIPs, thank you. Your support is more appreciated than you know. And to the weekly subscribers, thank you as well, and especially those of you that are sharing the stories with others. As always, tonight, and especially tonight, I ask you to have a prayer in your heart. This first story comes from this book right here, written by Andrew Olson. It is the book about the story of the Martin and Willie Handcart Company. And I'm working on this book right now, and I found this story, and thanks to Andrew, I'm going to share it with you. October 14th, 1856, about 20 miles west of Fort Laramie, Wyoming, on the Pioneer Trail, John Jakes of the Martin Handcart Company, quote, finally began to break down. He had pulled his sister-in-law in his handcart for 170 miles in Iowa. After his wife, Zilpah, had a baby in August, he had pulled her on the cart for more than 100 miles in Nebraska. He was exhausted from caring for his wife, his sick 2-year-old daughter, his baby son, his wife's family, who had been without a man since his father-in-law had passed away 3 weeks earlier, and caring for the 100 members of the handcart company over whom he was sub-captain, end of quote. So not only is John Jakes bearing the weight of a cart heavy enough already, but it's made all the heavier bearing the burden of love. Family members too ill to walk. The company traveled a hilly, heavy road that day, Andrew wrote. John's legs swelled. He was short of breath, and he could hardly walk. Where would help come from? His wife, Zilpah, seemed an unlikely source. Not only had she recently given birth, but her health had always been frail. Moreover, she was nursing her baby while she herself had scarcely enough to eat. It seemed to her that her baby was taking her own life, wrote her sister, Patience Loader. And here it is. Can you see the situation? This is the reason why I tell you this touching story. Quote, yet that day, Zilpah stepped inside the shafts of the handcart and pulled beside her husband. That night, John wrote in his journal with appreciation and perhaps some feeling of personal failure, quote, Zilpah pulled the cart with me nearly all day, end of quote. In this precarious condition, the Jakes family would face the first winter storm only 5 days away, end of quote. I don't know why that simple story touches me so much. The journey toward our promised land has become a heavy, hilly road, as it were, of late, and it's only going to get worse. It's too much to go it alone. Notwithstanding her own weakness, and even though she could have offered a plethora of excuses not to, Zilpah climbed down off the cart and into the shafts and pulled with John. She would not be the burden that's bearing, but she would bear the burden with him. Please consider all that implies. I pray daily for my married children whom I love with all my soul, that they will get it together and pull together. I pray for others that I love with all my heart, that they will receive worthy companions, willing and able to pull with them. We all have, as it were, a heavy handcart to pull. I pray that you are pulling your weight, and if you are all alone, be assured the Master is between the shafts with you. This next story I'm telling for a friend who requested it. We are commanded to pray always. As we do, does it follow naturally that we'll understand the answers and directions we always receive? No, of course not. Not by my experience. Some 25 or 30 years ago, Beth was driving home from helping to set up a church dinner they were having that night. She was not far from her own home when she said, quote, "I felt hands on my steering wheel and it turned my car to the right onto a road that led to an apartment complex down at the bottom of the hill, curvy road." Her mind went instantly to two women that she knew lived there and were part of her church responsibility. She said, "My car turned to the left, and I knew where I was needed." She found a place to park and went up and knocked on the door. The woman answered. Beth described what happened next. Quote, "She was dressed a little nicer than her normal business attire, and we greeted each other and chatted for a minute when the conversation dragged. I kept thinking I would be shown what she needed, but before long we were just looking at each other and the quiet got awkward. I noticed the latest copy of the Ensign on her coffee table and stepped in to grab it and started flipping through while making comments about some of what I saw. Suddenly she asked in a somewhat irritated tone, 'Why are you here?' My response was, 'I don't know. Why don't you tell me?' She started crying. She said, 'I'll tell you why you're here. My mother prayed you here.' She told me her mom went to the temple weekly and would pray to commend the blessings of her temple attendance to me because I needed them more than she did. She then explained that in her work as a receptionist, she regularly had contact with a delivery driver who delivered to their company. We started with just being friendly. Then it moved to harmless flirting, but it soon turned into calls. We planned to meet today, and I know that I would have broken my temple covenants if I saw him. I told her what had happened on my end," Beth said, and she was, of course, overwhelmed. Beth concluded with this insight. "I was blessed with this amazing example of how prayers can work and how the Lord can bless both the one who needed the prayers and the one who is willing to answer his call." End of quote. What is important here, my friends, is that we are always willing to let the Lord take the wheel, as it were, and be led. Next story. The year was 74 BC, and the peace of the Nephites was about to be shattered. A people called the Zoramites revolted and formed an alliance with the Lamanites, the avowed enemies of the Nephites. The adversary of all men stirred the Zoramites to anger, and the Zoramites in turn stirred the Lamanites up to anger, and war was the only solution to their irrational slights. Captain Moroni and the armies of the Nephites saw the preparations for war and knew that it was coming. So Moroni began to prepare his people for war in a manner the Lamanites had never seen before: armor, shields, breastplates, arm shields, etc., while the Lamanites prepared for battle. They got naked, save it were a skin which was girded about their loins. I have never seen the sense of going into battle naked in a sword fight. Anyway, seeing the bristling defenses of the Nephites, the Lamanite-Zoramite alliance, well, they decided not to attack a frontal assault at Jershon. Instead, they gathered all their armies up and departed into the wilderness in a wandering course, intending to mislead the Nephites. it would appear that they set out on a course to nowhere. And that's what it looked like. But their destination really was Manti, which was the weaker part of the land. Their stratagem, stealth, and surprise. Moroni sent spies to watch the armies. How far they trailed them, I don't know. But he also sent certain men to Alma. Alma is the Lord's prophet. Now herein is a remarkable thing. Moroni was an accomplished soldier, a fighter, a man of skill, determination, and grit. Yet he was also a man of Christ, with faith in the living God and in his authorized servants. If Moroni was going into battle, he wanted God as his ally. The trusted messengers of Moroni went to Alma and asked, "Where are the Lamanites going?" Alma inquired of the Lord and came back not only with the Lamanites' destination, but also their stratagem. He told them that the Lamanites were marching roundabout in the wilderness, that they might come over into the land of Manti, that they might commence an attack upon the weaker part of the people. End of quote. Now, it's remarkable enough that Moroni, a dedicated soldier, would come to the prophet for battle intel. But what happens next is even more remarkable. With nothing more than Alma's word on it, Moroni left a part of his army in the land of Jershon, and the rest of his army he marched in a straight course to the land of Manti. Along the way, he rallied the local citizenry to get ready for war. He worked out battle strategies based on the landscape, predicting where the Lamanites would enter Manti. Then, with great planning, detail, and effort, he divided and strategically placed his armies and waited. Then he sent spies into the wilderness that he might know when the camp of the Lamanites should come. Just as Alma had foretold, the Lamanites came exactly where Moroni expected them to, and because of the Nephites' careful preparation, they won the day. Notwithstanding that the Lamanites were more than double their numbers and did fight like dragons, the Nephites won. Not the least of which, because of faith. My friends, be like Moroni. Expect the devil and his soldiers to make war upon you. They will. They have. They'll continue. Prepare in every detail for the fight. Counsel with the Lord in all things. Take the prophets as your ally, and then fight with faith in the God of battles. Do it, and you will win. Next story. I'm indebted to Peggy Peterson for the research on this story. Thank you. Mary Graham was born April 4th, 1830 in Glasgow, Scotland. By the age of 14, her mother had passed away, the family had moved to Kirkintilloch, Scotland, and around that same time, an elder from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints knocked on the door. According to family records, it appears all he did was leave a tract with them. Mary's father was on his deathbed. He read that tract and he proclaimed, quote, "Mary, my girl, that is true. I believe that. I believe that young man has come with the true gospel. I won't be able to remain long with you, but you look for the true gospel described in this tract, and if you ever find it, you can safely embrace it." End of quote. Kind of reminds you of the story of Abish in the Book of Mormon. With the death of her father, Mary became an orphan. She went to work for a wealthy family named Allen. Now, Mary found where the Latter-day Saints were meeting and attended meetings with them. However, when the Allen family discovered that she was associating with the Mormons, they were angry. Rumors convinced them that Mary's associations would hurt their business, and so they gave her a bitter ultimatum. Mary, there is the door. You take your choice right now. Either our home and give up Mormonism, or out of our home into the night. End of quote. Family records indicate Mary cried. But with grit that became characteristic of that woman for the rest of her life, she replied, quote, I would be falsifying if I said it was not true. My father told me it was true when he was on his deathbed, and I know it is true for myself. End of quote. With 1 shilling in her pocket, Mary was sent out into the night. She's 14 and alone. She took that shilling and went to the owner of the local town hall and asked to rent the hall as a place for the elders to preach. Now, 1 shilling was not enough, but because the man knew Mary's father and honored him, he gave her the hall for that 1 shilling. When the elders discovered what the courageous teenager had done, they gave her a blessing, promising her that she would never want. In March 1852, Mary married Archibald Miller Young. She taught him the gospel, and soon he was baptized. Together, Mary and Archibald would have 13 children. In 1872, Mary and her family immigrated to Zion. Family records state, quote, when they arrived in Salt Lake City, the Allen family was there to welcome them and took them to their home for a wonderful banquet. Remember them? The ones that turned her out in the night back in Scotland? They said to her, quote, you are the cause of our being in the church, they declared. When Mary had so courageously left their home in Scotland, rather than give up the true faith, the Allen family concluded that her religion must be something extraordinary. They knew she was one of the sweetest, best, and most beautiful girls of their acquaintance. Mr. Allen said, quote, I cannot help but feel that there's something more to Mormonism than we understand. It cannot be just a man-made religion. He and his family investigated, joined the church, emigrated to Utah years before Mary, and welcomed Mary and her family when they arrived in Salt Lake. Well, Mary went on to live a life of courage, faith, obedience, an example to all in Zion. Just before her death in 1911, Mary called her children to her and told them the story I just told you, particularly of the blessing given by the elders when she was but 14 years of age. And then Mary declared, quote, you may never be asked to give all that you have for the gospel's sake. But if you are, give it. I would like you to be as liberal with the Lord as he has been to you. I am 80 years of age and I have never wanted. That blessing has been fully realized. So I leave this with you, children, that even if it takes the last cent you have for the church, it is the finest thing you can ever do. She passed away, and according to the records, is buried in Richfield, Utah. That testimony left a lasting impression on Mary's posterity. I hope that this story will likewise stick to you for the rest of your days. I received an email just today that it's the beginning of tithing settlement. This next story I share again by request. It is a word-for-word transcript from an audio recording made in 1954. The man speaking is Ezekiel Johnson Sr. and tells the story of an event that took place in about 1909 in Blanding, Utah. Okay? He said, quote, "I've been requested by my friend to set in stone an experience I had in about the year 1908 or 9 in San Juan County. At that time, I was just making me a home in Blanding, and the whole country wide was covered with trees and sagebrush, and I was working hard to clear ground to plant a few more acres of corn. At last, I had about 5 acres cleared, and I went one day to plant the corn. My little boy, Roy, some 7 or 8 years old, was there to plant the corn. I would plow around the piece, and every third row he'd plant corn in the furrow. Then I'd cover it and plow again. And while plowing along that piece of ground, now mind you, he said, I had discovered that there were ancient houses on that ground, that is, remnants of them. As I was plowing along, all of a sudden I noticed my plowshare had turned out the skeleton of a small child, the skull and the backbones. And most of the bones, of course, were decayed and gone, but there was part of the skeleton there. I stopped immediately, and as my plow had passed it a little bit, I turned and looked back against the bar of the plow between the handles and was looking at that little skeleton that I'd plowed out and wondering. All of a sudden, to my surprise, the bones began to wiggle, and they began to change position, and they began to take on a different color. And within a minute, there lay as beautiful a little skeleton as anyone could possibly think of. Perfect little skeleton. Then I saw the inner parts of the natural body coming in, the entrails. And I saw the flesh coming on. I saw the skin come on the body. When the inner parts of the body was complete and the skin on it, then a beautiful head of hair adorned the top of the head. In about a half a minute, after the hair was on the head, it had a beautiful crystal decoration in the hair. It was combed beautifully, parted on one side. The child raised up on her feet. She was laying a little on her left side. Her back was towards me. I wasn't able to discern the sex of the child, but as she raised up, a beautiful robe came down over her left shoulder, and I saw that it must be a girl. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and for a quarter of a minute we just looked at each other, smiling. Then my ambition to get hold of her, I said, "Oh, you beautiful child." And I reached out as I'd like to embrace her, and she disappeared. That's all I saw of it. I stood there, and I wondered, and I thought for a few minutes. My little boy was wondering why I was there because he was down at the other end of the row, anxious to come and plant the corn. Now, Zeke goes on. I couldn't tell that story to anybody. It was so mysterious to me, and such, what shall I say, a miraculous experience. I couldn't feature any human being in such a condition as to be accidentally plowed that little body out and then stand there and see it come alive, full body of a child of about 5 to 7 years old, I would say. Well, I couldn't tell that story to anyone. Until finally one day I met a dear friend of mine, the stake patriarch, Wayne H. Redd of Blanding, and he stopped me on the street and he said, "Zeke, you have had an experience on this mesa that you won't tell. I want you to tell it to me." Well, I told it to him. Then he had me tell it to other friends, and since then I've told it in 4 of the temples in the United States, many meeting houses, and in many socials, fast meetings, conference times. And I wondered. It worried me for years, several years. It worried me. Why was I compelled to see it? A common man like me, non-educated, just a common man. Why was I compelled to see such a marvelous manifestation of God's power? And one day, I was walking along with my hoe on my shoulder, going to hoe some corn, and something said, "Stop under the shade of that tree a few minutes and rest." That just came to me. And I thought I would. I stopped there, and this was given to me. It was an answer to my prayers. I prayed incessantly, continually for the why of my having to see that great resurrection. Then I was told that when that child was buried there, it was either in a time of war with the different tribes, or else it was in winter time when the ground was frozen, and they had no tools like we have to dig deep graves. And if it was in a time of war, they couldn't possibly take the time to dig a deep grave. They just planted that little body as deep as they could under the circumstances. And then when it was done, and the sorrowing mother came up, I knew that that was such a shallow little grave in her sorrow. She cried out to the little group that was there, that little shallow grave. The first beast that comes along will smell her body. They'll dig her out and scatter her to the four winds. Her bones would be scattered all over these flats. But there happened to be a man there holding the priesthood, a Nephite or a Jaredite. I don't know which, because they've both been in this country. I've been in their houses. I know it. This man that had authority to hold the priesthood said, "Sister, calm your sorrows. The first time, or whenever that little body is disturbed or uncovered, the Lord will call her up and she'll go to heaven." Since that time, Zeke said, I have taken great comfort, great cheer and satisfaction, with praises in heart and soul, till I haven't the words to express it. That was me that uncovered that little body. Thank you, he concluded, for listening to me. I can't tell it without crying. End of quote. The story was given to me by Irene Jepson. I've always marveled at that story. It leads me to conclude that the most common of us, myself as the most common, can see miracles and work wonders if we have faith. Last story for tonight. Sarah Chantry was born December 31st, 1824, in Mansfield, Nottinghamshire, England, the fourth daughter of John Chantry and Maria Boskill. Sarah grew up poor, neither able to read or write, her signature merely a witnessed X. Sarah grew into a young woman, tall, with light brown hair and blue eyes. In April 1844, she married John in Mansfield. His occupation is variously listed as both a coal miner and a framework knitter, both occupations of abject poverty and hard work. Together, John and Sarah would have 10 children. Their youngest, Harry, was born when Sarah was 42 years old. In 1851, missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints came into the area of Swanwick, Derbyshire, where John and Sarah lived. We don't know who they were. They were looking for a place to hold meetings. John and Sarah welcomed them into their home. Now, previous to their coming, John had sang in the choir of the Baptists for years and was at that time considering joining the Baptist church. But now, in John's mind, he had found something greater. He was baptized April 20th, 1851. Sarah followed him shortly thereafter, May 1st, 1851. The place of their baptism was Golden Valley, Derbyshire, England. Then in March of 1852, likely because of John's missionary labors, John's parents, Francis and Jane, entered the waters of baptism. Shortly after that, John was ordained an elder and began preaching. He was also set apart as the branch president. And together, John and Sarah served the Lord and worked to make ends meet. They lived happily. Even though members of Sarah's family became very bitter against her after her baptism. Well, like so many others, John and Sarah wanted to gather with the saints in Zion. They were filled with the spirit of the gathering. It burned in their soul. Now, to help assist saints who were too poor, like John and Sarah, to pay their own way alone, the church established the Perpetual Immigrating Fund. Records indicate that John also served as an administrator of that fund. And yet, from 1851 to 1868, 17 years, Sarah and John were unable to make that journey. Could it be that John selflessly allocated those funds to everyone else before himself? I don't know. Finally, June 10th, 1868, two of Sarah's children, Frances and Jane, received word that the way was prepared for them to leave by the PEF for America. Upon receiving word, Francis, with his brother Joseph, walked to the family home in Swanwick. They found their father ill. He died a half an hour after they arrived. The conference president, Louis Shurtleff, advised that Sarah take the place of her older children and set sail immediately for America. Obediently, July 14th, 1868, 1 month to the day of John's burial, Sarah bid goodbye to her homeland, her family, her husband's grave, everything she had known and loved, and set sail for America on the ship Colorado. In her care were her 4 youngest children. The baby, Harry, was only 8 months old. Caring for John in his last days had left Sarah broken in health and in heart. And in those difficult circumstances, she crossed the Atlantic. September 2nd, 1868, Sarah arrived in Salt Lake City. She was sent on to Farmington, where friends helped her secure a small house and an old rusty stove. Characteristic of her, she set to work and cleaned off the rust. Sarah made a clean, comfortable home. Her neighbors marveled at her being able to keep her home spotless and care for her children. By August 1871, the last of Sarah's children arrived in Utah. They were all together, at last, in Zion. The family then went to work, and in 1874, they purchased a home for their mother in Plain City, Utah. It was there, by thrift and industry, the sale of fruit and vegetables, and the pay she received from working out at housework, Sarah was able to gather around her more of the comforts of life than she had ever known before. 3 things now to summarize Sarah's story. She never married again. While living in Plain City, she learned to read and write at last. 3, she was faithful to the gospel all her days. Sarah labored as a Relief Society visiting teacher for many years. She was always generous to those less fortunate than herself. End of quote. The sacrifices of Sarah Chantry changed the history of her family forever. Generations have and will yet call her blessed for those sacrifices. Praise be the Lord for her faith. I didn't tell you her full name. Sarah Chantry Rawson, my great-great-grandmother. John, who died in England, was my great-great-grandfather. And that babe on the hip who was only 8 months old, Harry, that was my great-grandfather. I am who I am because she was who she was. My friends, Praise be the Lord. I hope you have a great week. Good night, and God bless.